AI is not based on imitation of biological intelligence or human intelligence. AI is itself a crystallization of collective intelligence. It's part of the cooperation of our mind and bodies through the society. So here we have a political dimension. How do we organize collectively, and what is our understanding, and evaluation of a collective agency? And I think this is an important political point.
Hello, welcome to the Verso YouTube channel. My name is Richard Hames, and I'm here with Professor Matteo Pasquinelli to discuss his new book, The Eye of the Master, a social history of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a concept that I think is now very widely known. People refer to it often in kind of daily conversation. They have a notion of the AI as a sort of a single homogeneous unit. This is a very widespread notion, but it's also one that's informed particularly by very recent developments and what we normally think of, or more precisely would think of as generative AI. That is, you type in a prompt and then you get something out of it. You get an image, a text, something like this. And this is almost a kind of magical view of AI that we have, I think. People have pretty commonly. Type something in, you get a magical box, something amazing comes out. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. We don't really know. Your book situates artificial intelligence in a much longer history, in the whole kind of social process of the construction and design, operation of algorithms, which you take to be a very capacious category. And I want to start with that notion of the algorithm. So you have this very beautiful diagram. I'm not quite sure exactly where it's from, the Vedic diagram of the
Agnikayana.
Yeah, precisely. Which is a sort of social process. Maybe you can talk us through like how you see that as an algorithm, because it's not the kind of thing we might normally culturally associate with algorithmic structure.
Yeah, I think one of the purpose of my book was like to provincialize AI, to put in a long history of cultural technique, and to show that techniques of abstraction belong to many civilizations across history. So even the idea of the algorithm that today we perceive as a sort of indeed technological abstraction that belongs to very complex software is a mathematical technique that has a very long history. And if we look at this Hindu ritual, the Agnikayana, that is the oldest ritual of humankind still practiced today, is 3,000 years old, recorded by oral sources at the beginning. You can see that already in ancient India they were building fire altars, temples, according to very mechanical procedures. They were actually repeated, chanted through mantra that look like algorithm, not just in their mechanical structure, in their kind of robot-like behavior. The workers were moving bricks following, this mantra, but also in the fact that we're embedding mathematical technique, like differential equation that maybe we could recognize today in the work of Newton or Leibniz. So the Agnikayana is a very fascinating example of a very ancient ritual that already contained many centuries ago sophisticated technique. And what is interesting of the Agnikayana is to be what I call it a social algorithm. So I start from this example, to provincialize, to recontextualize AI, and to show how this sociality, how collectivity actually operate through the whole history of mathematics. I believe also, when modern mathematics started to emerge in the West, at least in the Middle Ages, and up to the recent algorithms of computing machine, but also of sophisticated techniques like deep learning that have been, in my view, emerging gradually, in the last decades, like a sort of, avatar growing out of social relations that have been condensing, accumulating, becoming data, big data, like through the ramification of our social relation networks, digital networks, and so on.
And both these computational instantiations of algorithms and these more general social processes, or more broader social processes, follow the basic definition of an algorithm, which is a finite procedure of step-by-step instructions, which has an input and an output. And then that process, to some extent, independent of the data that goes into it. Is that the broad kind of definition of algorithm that you're using?
I think the definition you gave, it's culturally correct. For computer scientists, they're a very technical definition. But what I'm interested is in the genealogy of technical artifact. And actually, how do we explain this development? What is our theory of automation today? And actually, we don't have a robust theory of automation. I'm interested in the fact that machines during, for instance, the industrial age emerge gradually from experiment, from the division of labors. To me, the concept of the algorithm, that of course is more immaterial, that belong, to the information age, that belong to the age of computers, is have a very similar in its genesis to the notion of machine. So I see algorithm as sort of, I think I'm not the first one to say that. I think even Minsky probably was using this expression like abstract machines, right? But to me, it's interesting. We have a political economy of the machine. We have a political understanding of the machine. We have a lot of literature from the 19th century. We don't have a political reading of the algorithm, or we start only recently to do that. So my attempt was also to politicize the idea of the algorithm. And actually, your question goes to the point, because to introduce something complex like AI, it's good to clarify some basic notion. And the algorithm is one of this.
The politicization of the algorithm seems to be an important project. And I'm wondering how it relates to something else we might try and what you think of that, which is the naturalization of the algorithm. So we can say that we have rivers full of sediment, for example, and then the river flows and then it deposits the sediment in a structured ordering that is according to the weight of the particles and the solubility and temperature and many, many other things. Why is that not an algorithm? I feel like there's a skepticism is emerging.
Algorithms do not belong to the natural order. They belong to the social order. And one thing that I do in my attempt to sketch a political economy of the algorithm, as much as a political economy of the machine, is the fact that I respond to an economic logic. And actually, what is at the core of the idea of machine itself, and the algorithm too, is the fact that they have to follow an economic logic. They have to, save resources of time, space. So there is an intrinsic economic logic that sometimes is not clarified in the definition given by computer scientists. Computer scientists, they are aware of this because they have to save resources, but it's clear that the algorithm has to do something very efficiently, consuming less resources than other solutions. And so this is very important. This is, of course, tied up the algorithm to the complex dynamics of our economy, of our society. Rivers don't have this problem. So in that sense, right? So there's a difference between natural order and social order.
Rivers don't have that problem. That's maybe a bad example, but I'm not going to labour this point, but I think maybe there's something about, for example, the way that body plans work in organisms as they're gestating in the womb, right? The way in which they structure the different components and organisation of the organism as it's developing in a way that responds to restrictions, the way it responds to a sort of overall distribution of resources in the, and so on. Well, let's not labour the point there.
But I think your idea, it's very close to what was also the program of cybernetics. Cybernetics had, wrongly in my opinion, the idea that machines and organs were organized in the same way. And this is part of the fetish we developed towards cybernetics, sort of vitalism that we like in cybernetics, but I think it's bringing us in the wrong direction. So there is, in my book, there is a critique of this sort of cybernetic vitalism and how all the discussion they had about the fact that organisms were like organized as machine, we could design machine like organism, but actually an ideological, cover up for imitation of other form of self-organization that happened in the society of the time. So indeed, there is a chapter in my book that you know about this critique of the idea of self-organization, that we cannot transplant, from the natural order to the technical order and back to the social order. But actually, we have to analyze that where it came from first.
One place where we might see that fetish operating most strongly today is with the collection of algorithms that come out of the deep learning revolution. And in particular, things like large language models. So one people will probably be familiar with is ChatGPT. This is the kind of prompt architecture I was talking about before. You write in a prompt, it gives you back some sort of like what seems to be a person speaking to you, right? It's like a pretty convincing illusion by this point. We've produced a sort of a hard beginning in some ways to the notion of algorithm, that it responds to the social order, or it's a logic of the social order. Is there something that we can point to specifically in machine learning or deep learning more particularly that allows us to understand the way in which algorithmics is entering a new era of its sort of long history?
I think the algorithm that we try to define as a basic unit today, of course, explode in terms of complexity scale. So when we say that ChatGPT has, I don't know how many parameters today, but trillions, right? What does it mean? We have what is called a parameterized machine that adjusts the parameters to a large data set. This is an algorithm, but clearly also from this description is an adaptive algorithm, right? And this adaptive algorithm that I explain more in details how it was originated in the 1950s, the structure of artificial neural networks, is an adaptive algorithm that we show to be very efficient in modeling any form of human culture, right? So from visual data set, images, pictures at the beginning, now even text, what are called multimodal data set. What is astonishing is that collective intelligence, human intelligence, cultural heritage, is modeled by this system. We discover recently, we knew because our experiment existed since decades, but we discovered recently that these algorithms, these adaptive algorithms, are very efficient in modeling language, and generating also very realistic language items, sentences, text. And this is very interesting because I think will affect maybe also the way linguistics is done today. So there is very interesting phenomena related to the recent development of deep learning.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular so it's an algorithm that is adaptive? Let's just dig into that notion of adaptation. Like, what is it that you mean by adaptive in algorithmic terms? So it's that the parameters of the algorithm are in some ways determined by the input. So the input and the algorithm are interrelated in this sort of feedback loop.
I think if you want to go into technical details,
Please.
what is at the core of artificial intelligence is a specific technique that is not very often a name, term, and it's algorithmic modeling. It's something that was invented in 1950, was the first artificial neural network, and I think it's an artifact that needs much more research and theorization. Going back to the example of language, what is very interesting, right, is the fact that at the beginning of information technology, you have a formalization of language, right? So an information machine is basically a machine operating through a very simplified language. It is a binary language. That was the idea that Shannon somehow inherited also from the telegraph, that is operating with a binary language. You have this extreme formalization that somehow started the computer revolution as a form of language machine. We can call it like that, information machine or language machine. At the very end, I'm not surprised that then through a few steps of this technological development, you have a machine very good at modeling languages. Once we have reduced languages to some very basic units, so very binary opposition simply, and then how we basically projected language through this complex space of deep learning.
So we now have a very capacious. Sorry, you can have we now have a very capacious view of what an algorithm is as a sort of social form that is bearing out the subtitle of your book, Social History of Artificial Intelligence. And in particular, you say that the source of many algorithmic sort of properties or designs, or the kind of the thing that algorithms are sort of parasitic on in their computational form, is the social division of labor. This is a very kind of crucial idea. This is in some ways the main thesis, as far as I read it, of the book. And I wonder if there's a kind of way of maybe just expanding on this that I'm going to kind of suggest, and then you can tell me why it's wrong, which is that in Marxism, classically, we have a split between the relations of production and the means of production. And I wonder if there's a sort of a way in which the structure of the relations of production in producing a particular commodity and sort of laying out the design of a factory, let's say, or laying out the overall design for labor in a society, that whole schema is then abstracted and then placed or sort of inscribed inside part of the means of production. And so we have this kind of translation from the relations of production into the means of production. That's one way I could think that we might sort of talk about this in conventional Marxist terms. But what am I getting wrong here? What's the argument?
No, I don't think your argument is wrong because it's also the thesis of my book. As I said, we have a political economy of the machine. We don't have a political economy of the algorithm. We describe very well, the rise of industrial machinery according to was the logic of the division of labor and the economy of the industrial age. I think the same model fits perfectly the rise of artificial intelligence in the 20th to 21st century. So I think we have to go back to this almost for say forgotten theory of automation. In the book, I call it labor theory of automation. That actually was an idea by Adam Smith and Babbage before being an idea actually used by Marx and also Hegel himself. When Hegel, had this intuition or this coined the expression. Concept of abstract labor. I think we should go back to that idea that machine emerged from the imitation of the division of labor, plus, of course, as I said before in the case of the algorithm, you have an economic rationale. So machine, they have to save time and space, and it's not the case that, for instance, the chapter on machinery in Capital Volume 1 is within the part on the production of relative surplus value. And I think this labor form and value form have to be also recognized within what are the dynamics of algorithms today. And I think we can bring many examples, from platform capitalism to artificial intelligence to show how indeed this is, at least for me, from my perspective, is the economy of computation today and of AI. And I think what is very important is to demystify AI and to show how it's not an invention, of mathematicians, engineer, geniuses. It's not something coming from the study of biological intelligence, but it's clearly, something that has emerged gradually from a sort of crystallization of social relation and then following automation. In the 19th century, it was used to say, first organize, then mechanize. That was the slogan, right? Today, I think we can use the same slogan. We can say maybe first formalize, then automate through AI.
You mentioned Babbage there. And the other crucial thing that Babbage invents is the idea that the automation of labor is also its measuring, or also its calculation. And I want to if you could talk us through why you see that as so important to the machine theory of labor. The labor theory of machines. Sorry. Machine theory of labor, very bad theory.
No.
Labor theory of the machine, much better.
The labor theory of the machine. One part of the book is a kind of archaeology of machines and algorithms, especially the first part. And it goes back to debate that you had in England here around the machinery question, actually. The machinery question was a large debate that happened in England before Marx. What is a machine? What is a machine doing to labor, to workers, to society, and so on. Babbage had a clear intuition that was not just the fact that the machines were this mechanical monster emerging, imitating the division of labor, but that the division of labor itself allowed the accurate measurement of cost in production. So there is this dimension of metrics, this dimension of measurement of human performance, but also of human skill. So Babbage knew that any division of labor, including the machines in this apparatus, were producing also and defining different classes of skill and actually producing polarization within the skills in the factory and so on. I think the same happened with information technology, with the algorithm of AI, and I think we have to keep this lesson in mind when we study algorithms today. Algorithms are indeed forms of labor automation. Can bring many examples, but at the same time they become implicitly instrument or implicit instrument of measurement, implicit metrics of human capacity. The case of artificial intelligence for me is striking because clearly AI today is implicitly a measure of human skill and human intelligence. AI can be taken, in a very rudimentary way to show what people can and what people cannot do. That can be used also even to threat workers to show what the machine can do. So it enters immediately. We can have, any of us can have this experience. But then in the book I show how the algorithms themselves of AI, of deep learning, emerged in the 1950s from psychometrics. So from the discipline of psychology, statistics, that actually introduced the IQ test, the test of the test of intelligence. Test of intelligence is like this brutal,
Yes.
this brutal procedure through which you determine the intelligence of a person according to numerical result in a cognitive test of different, task capacities. But that was like the statistical technique that was used by Rosenblatt also to automate image recognition. And this is, for me, a way implicitly, the way in which implicitly AI is veiculating, a matrix of human intelligence, but that is connected to very reductivist social order.
Yeah. So on the one hand, we have in the design of these systems, we have an implicit parasitism or implicit withdrawing of a logic from a social division of labour, which instantiates a hierarchy, a sort of hierarchy of labour, which is what division of labour actually means. And then they get translated into a sort of means of production, into a sort of a machinery that itself then reinforces later on that self-same hierarchy which it's based on. I wonder if you could talk to us about that reinforcement of the hierarchy, or give us a particular example of the way in which you think a particular, say, machinic system might enforce, say, discrimination or forms of hierarchization in that labour process.
Yeah, in the book I use the expression crystallization of social relations that becomes, of course, the crystallizations of hierarchies. It's clear that any machine, mechanical machine, information machine, and today AI, produce a polarization of skills. Back in the industrial age, you had skilled and unskilled labor. You had the role of, workers who were just supervising the machine, what Marx called Maschinenarbeiter. They're just, people in front of the machine, regulating the machine, not doing much. With information technology, we have the same. We have this polarization and bifurcation. I have a little chapter about how, indeed, also the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon had the idea that the industrial machine itself already was born out of this bifurcation of the source of energy and the source of information that was producing, two different also classes of work, of labor, of performance to be done within the fact. I think the same is happening probably with artificial intelligence, but the very in a very, very complex way. It's clearly that we see how I think Facebook and Google themselves in the last year have been, firing out so many people, especially coders, because they are aware that some part of their work can be automated by these large language models. So these large language models are entering the labor market and producing polarization themselves, and producing and pushing, indeed, classes of workers in opposite direction. Those can be easily automated, and those that cannot be easily automated. So I think it's a very complex phenomenon that starting, from manual labor, going through, different component of the labor market, produce different waves of bifurcating skill. The impact, however, of these large language models, for me, is interesting because it's not simply about replacing workers in their whole capacity, but it's more like replacing microtasks in our daily activity as worker or in the office, in the sense that each of us has used, this system to translate small text, right? So it's not that, for instance, if we take the work of the translator, it's not the replacement of the translator in his entirety, but like microtasks that translator maybe they have to perform in their daily work. And this will happen to many categories of work. Think about graphic designer, people working for advertisement agency. When these tools are known, any boss will know that can be used, also to extract, to demand more performativity. So what I perceive, in the effect of AI on the labor market is this: not just the replacement of the whole tasks, but the replacement of microtasks in our daily routine. And this will have, of course, an effect because through this system we will be forced to work more, probably, not less.
And so there's this paradox in AI research called the Moravec paradox. I think I'm pronouncing that.
Which one?
Moravec. Who knows? Moravec. Where tasks that seem trivial to humans, so for example, moving around, balancing, walking around, picking things up, putting them down, those kind of tasks that seem trivial turn out to be incredibly difficult from a computational perspective. And then tasks that in some sense seem easier, so it seemed harder from a human perspective in the sort of conventional social hierarchy, playing chess, playing Go, now writing letters, are actually computationally much sort of simpler. And that's generally used to refer to a sort of strange paradox, which is why, for example, we might say it's not so unusual that coders are being made redundant. We think of coding as a sort of a high prestige, high value, high difficulty task, and yet lots of them are being made redundant by ChatGPT 4. But in some ways, if we look back at the longer history, we might say that it's not that those kind of manual tasks are as such harder to automate, but that automation has already proceeded so far through the history of other technologies, not AI, but other technologies. We've reached a state where they actually now have reached some sort of plateau, and it's difficult to do self-driving cars, for instance.
Yes.
And therefore, I wonder what you think about this.
Clearly, yeah, we see we perceive the effect of AI automation specifically, in the sector of white collars. But I would like to go back to the first paradox, actually, that I mentioned, the very first page of the book, that today, strangely, we discover, manual workers, like truck drivers or car drivers, as sort of a task in which a high degree of intelligence is embedded, because we try to automate, the activity of a truck driver, for instance, through deep learning. So it's very interesting, or it's a kind of bitter, political insight that we recognize, the cognitive import of manual labor today, because AI is trying to automate these activities. So I think this is another paradox maybe we should rediscover for ourselves, that indeed this system are very efficient. We call them multimodal. They're able to model not just, indeed, very efficient when they have, of course, to model language, when you have to operate on textual data set, but also very efficient when they have to model 3D signals, images, video that could represent the scene of a street in which a car has to go through. We know there are a big limitation, but it's interesting how, indeed, we are rediscovering through AI, the fact that all labor has been always a kind of, cognitive labor. Of course, we knew that, but there has been a sort of, amnesia also of our political economy, labor organization, critical theory about this aspect. So I would like to go back to this other paradox that actually we are encountering now.
Yeah, so rediscovering the intellectual aspects of what seemed like they were the most kind of manualized forms of labor, for sure. You say at one point, and maybe it's a polemical statement, I'd like you to sort of unpack it, all labor is logic. This seems like a kind of a really, in some ways, it's a provocative statement, right? Because reading it from the perspective of someone who is in some ways being taught that the ways in which labor is organized or automated is a reduction, or a sort of an assault on the true creative spirit of humanity, or something like this. How do you see that notion of the logic functioning in that sort of context?
Yeah, I think it's a provocation in both directions. A provocation for our understanding of and definition of labor today, also within labor organization, critical theory, but also as a provocation clearly towards computer scientists, mathematicians, and cyberneticians. And on one side is indeed as a critique of the idea that labor is just a manual activity. On the other is the idea that logic itself has a history, that logic emerged through a kind of complex history, and you have different logics. And this is also clear in the case of artificial intelligence that today, for instance, is not following the deductive logic of the 1950s and the good old-fashioned AI, but of course moved to a completely different paradigm, that is the one of statistical learning and inductive logic. So when I say labor is logic, is also an attempt to merge two worlds, two kind of communities. On one side, if you want, the political economists; on the other, the computer scientists. And it goes back for me also to the history of this artifact that I try, this abstract artifact that I try to retrace back to a social history. Then, if we look attentively of this kind of social logic that we embed, we crystallize into machine, we can bring many examples, from art or from ancient rituals and so on.
There's a Robert Hewlett-Kentor article called The Exact Sense in Which the Culture Industry No Longer Exists. And so he's talking about this phrase that Adorno uses, the culture industry. And he says that the reason that the culture industry no longer properly exists is because what Adorno would have seen as the obvious tension and sort of friction between these two words, culture on the other hand, and industry on the other hand. When we look at the word today, it no longer jumps out at us as a contradiction, that there would be such a thing as a culture industry. And in some ways, there's sort of a similar friction that you're implying between these two worlds, the world of labour and the world of logic, and the way in which they grind against each other in this sort of terminological provocation, trying to bring these two things together and show how they fit, even though both sides would, of course, refuse the idea that there is sort of a continuity there. I want to go towards this history of logic idea, because I feel like there might be a sort of difference between us, and we can talk about that. At one point, you're talking about Rosenblatt and his work in psychometry, and the way in which that statistical techniques that he uses to do these, what are psychometric evaluations, and those themselves, as you were mentioning earlier, proceed from the history of eugenics. And these kinds of multidimensional analyses that he uses, he then reapplies elsewhere to the question of perception. And this you note as a particularly significant kind of moment of translation between these different kinds of social logics. And I guess my intuition, as someone who is not particularly well versed in this history, is that passing through this abstract mathematical object of multidimensional analysis in some ways cleans the history out. Right? There's a sense that the maths has an autonomy, that maths is not exactly floating above the world, but that techniques are discovered and not merely invented. That there's sort of an independence to mathematics that means that when we reapply a certain set of techniques, it's neutral in some sense. Tell me why that's not the right way of thinking about the history of mathematics.
Okay, now going back to this not well researched and known moment in the history of AI that actually we should one day dedicate probably monography. So what I'm intrigued is the fact that when Rosenblatt somehow produced a convincing solution for the problem of image recognition, that is a kind of intellectual faculty of the human mind, how you recognize an image, he was using a technique derived from psychometrics, as we mentioned before. You know, the technique of statistical psychology to measure the intellectual capacity of a human being, considering the relation between, different results in a cognitive test. So psychometrics, the IQ test, emerged as a way to measure numerically, statistically, human intelligence in a very reductivist way, as we know very well. I mean, I don't recommend anyone to do the IQ test to understand what intelligence is. And strangely, that measure of intelligence, that technique to measure intelligence, it became a medium to automate an intellectual faculty. I'm interested in this passage. It is very complex and difficult passage also for historians of science and technology. But the same thing happened in other historical moments. And you can also see, for instance, the rise of the steam engine, the way the steam engine emerged from also an idea to control and measure energy, to measure labor performance. That was a way in which, workers, human beings, but also animals like horses were measuring their performativity. And then from the measure of energy, at a certain point, you have a strange phenomenon in which you have a medium that produces energy and automate that kind of measurement you had before. So I'm very interested in very complex and difficult passages in the history of technology that also, for me, history of labor automation. Psychometrics is very fascinating. It's difficult to explain because it's applying, statistical tools of multivariable or multidimensional analysis as a history that is like a horrible history going back to eugenics and racist policies, comes out originally from craniometry, this pseudoscience that thought you needed to measure intelligence of human beings according to the dimension of the skull.
This is the image of people going out with calipers, right, to kind of measure skull shapes.
As Stephen Jay Gould has this great book that is The Mismeasure of Man, that I always suggest for anyone who wants to understand how AI operates today. It's one of, I think, probably the best book to understand the logic of AI as well. And so you had craniometry failed, psychometrics took basically the role of craniometry, but maintaining this idea that human intelligence could be measured, that we could define quantitatively, numerically, also classes of skill of intelligence through society. So, I mean, imposing social hierarchy of intelligence. And then at a certain moment in the Department of Psychology in the 1950s in the US, this technique, psychometrics, makes a jump and go into computer science. And Rosenblatt used it actually to organize its neural networks. And this is like a very unclear moment and very complex moment. And we find the same technique today at the core of deep learning. So even this very large language model like ChatGPT, they basically operate, manipulate, property of this multidimensional space. What is interesting for me, of course, mathematics, in my view, is not completely autonomous in its development. Psychometrics implied a very reductionist view of human intelligence and society. And I would say probably the same happens today with large language models in the way they reduce language. They're very efficient, probably because of this operation. They reduce in a very efficient way to a small unit, and then they can automate it efficiently. I think we will see then the effect of this reductionism not on the long run, maybe on the short run, in the way indeed however errors, phenomenon of a reduction of everyday language is already happening through the system.
I guess my question is what does that politically commit us to? So we notice that there is a history, when we explore the sort of genealogy of these techniques, we notice that there is a moment at which this technique is used or indeed formed in the service of a racist project that we would absolutely repudiate. And then what happens now? What do we do with the fact that does it commit us to anything politically or ethically? Should it shape the way in which we respond to these tools as they will be, thrust upon us or engage with our lives?
Yeah, I think what we should take from AI today is the fact that artificial intelligence itself is not this fantastic embodiment of intelligence, but we can use it actually as a great description of what is the state of the art in the collective intelligence. So all the biases, all the errors, all the problems you see in AI indeed are a fantastic photography of our culture today and political constitution. So rather than taking the system as indeed an embodiment of intelligence, we should take them as as a perfect photography of our mediocrity. And I think in this way we could develop a healthy dialectical relation with this system. And I think we should consider them in this way as imperfect machines. I think we should indeed provincialize AI, step back and see it in perspective. Also, the term AI, as I try also together with many other scholars to demonstrate, is a misnomer. We should one day maybe define the system as indeed, just system for algorithmic modeling. That we should find other expression like maybe statistical learning, to remove this anthropomorphic, basically simulacrum that we have attached to AI. And I think this is an important process to do also to avoid, some expectations and usual question about the systems.
You're absolutely right that there is a sort of a sense of the camera taking a picture here, that the snapshot of the internet, for example, as it was in 2021, I think is the last time that it was updated. Maybe more recently, 2023 was the latest ChatGPT 4 model was retrained at that point. So you're absolutely right, there's a sort of snapshot of mediocrity. I guess if we're to be suspicious of this very basic unit, which is the vector, right, the technical object that sits at the very basic kind of bottom of deep learning, if we're to be suspicious of its history, then why is it so sort of, in the terms of a famous paper, so unreasonably effective at modeling so many different domains of life? There's another thesis that people might be thinking of when they see the eye of the master, which is the thesis of the seeing like a state thesis, James C. Scott's work, which is that essentially quite similar in some ways, that there's a social organization of labor, of structure in society, such that it can be visualized, or such that it can be seen by the state, overseen. Things are organized such that they can be seen. And if we have this notion that AI forms a sort of a snapshot of the mediocrity of human culture, is there some sort of similarity you see in that thesis? Do you see there's a continuity there, or would you say there's a sort of a difference? And I mean, one of the major differences might be, for example, that James T. Scott is not, as far as I know, a Marxist, and therefore not really particularly concerned with like labour process, but concerned with a much more kind of heterogeneous collection of things.
No, I think indeed I insist in this book, on the primacy of labor organization in the way we design artifact. So I have a kind of, design theory that brings design itself and design of machine and also AI to what is the ontology of labor today. But what I try to do is also, to escape some categories of the political economy of the 19th century and to see how labor today takes different form through society and how you have social relations themselves that are becoming productive. And today, clearly, what our smartphone, the algorithm of platforms of the gig economy and the algorithm of AI are doing mostly, of course, they're not automating the labor in a factory, but they are like following our movement through the urban space, for instance. They are like, producing this very complex snapshot of the diagram of our relation through society. This is clearly also emerging through the way monopolistic platforms like social media are organized. So I think AI here is part, as we know, of this long evolution of the information society of the 20th century into the network society of the 90s. It's part of this evolution of the network society in this organization of few data centers around the planet that control all our communication. And the algorithm of machine learning then at the end emerged as a way to compute this surplus of information of this data center. So you have a gradual evolution. What we call today AI was machine learning and was before data analytics. So I see AI, the eye of the master, as a sort of evolution of this information infrastructure that is built on the data we produce, on social data, and is responding actually to a problem of elaboration, interpretation of those data. So today we have powerful algorithm because we had to compute massive amount of data, the big data. And big data, we should remember, doesn't mean just data that are large in size, but they're like, multiple in that dimension. They describe, different variables, parameters of your life. And, companies, they didn't know how to interpret this data. And they developed algorithm. And one day they found in machine learning and then in deep learning and then in this large language model, also called foundation model, the most efficient technique to interpret this data, that data, that are produced by our collective body, by the social organization of labor at large.
And what's the political valence of that? So we have this notion that there is in the large language model, the whole of human cognition up until this date, in some sense, is captured. The archive is snapshotted. What are the political valences of that? What should we then do with it? Do we understand it as a collective product of the whole of humanity? Do we understand it as a particular proprietary knowledge of this particular company? What are we to do how are we to interpret in the field of political struggle?
Yeah, no, this is an important question. I think today AI represent a mechanization of collective intelligence, a mechanization of the general intellect that Ricardian socialists somehow perceive as not, mechanized, as not materialized, represent, interestingly, indeed a mechanization of education, of cultural heritage. And I think we are not ready to understand what's happening. What is interesting is also the scale of this monopoly. Large language models can be computed only by large companies or superpowers that have a lot of computing power, facilities, data center to collect all this data, the powerful clouds where to amass all this data. So there is clearly a process of monopolization, and then this indeed monopoly on a model of our culture that is often controlled in a private way. And this is something that happens for the first time in the history of humanity. And what does it mean to fight politically this form of monopoly? I think this is part of the struggle around the new form of platform capitalism, of technological capitalism that is organizing through very few monopolies.
There's a sense in which these models, because they seem to encapsulate so much, give us a sense of what the human in a very general sense is. So we have this notion that by interacting with AI, we are interacting, or with GPT-4, let's be more specific, by interacting with GPT-4, we're interacting with like the whole wisdom of humanity. I've heard it described in these terms to me directly. But there's, of course, a kind of a way in which we might want to refuse the idea that that is the whole of humanity. You mentioned earlier the necessity of establishing what you described as a dialectical relationship with a technology. Is there a kind of notion of the human that you want to counterpose to this overall snapshot? Because the way in which you describe humanity, or the way in which you describe the particular intelligence of people in the book, is as situated, as sort of externalist, as kind of organized in relation to a situation. And I'm wondering if there's something you want to kind of rescue from this snapshot, or to dialectically oppose to this snapshot.
Yeah, I think, as I try to discuss in the book, the AI is not based on imitation of biological intelligence or human intelligence as, individual organisms. What is extremely interesting for me, that AI is itself a crystallization of collective intelligence. So what is collective intelligence? Collective intelligence is not, the intelligence we possess individually. Is part of, of the cooperation of our mind and bodies through the society. So here we have a political dimension. Now, there's been always part of any political project. How do we organize collectively, and what is our probably understanding, and evaluation of a collective agency? And here, for me, looking at the history of political movement, we see a process in which collective agency, collective intelligence is translated into machinery, and especially into monopoly control. And I think this is an important political point, and also an important point for culture, education, pedagogy, and these things.
There's a chapter in the book on Hayek. Friedrich Hayek, a famous neoliberal economist, and his relationship to connectionism. There's this extremely interesting 1952 book called The Sensory Order, which, as you say, precedes the Dartmouth Conference by 4 years, where nominally, although, as you point out, redundantly, lots of the initial ideas of AI were formed, sort of sketched out and so on. Some people nowadays on the left regard the arrival of AI as a sort of a way of resolving some of the main sort of problems, right? The capacity of this single object to speak in the interests of everyone, as a kind of a socialist technological utopianism that is being developed around AI. And I wonder if there's a kind of your framing of Hayek as sort of being the seat of this, suggests either that this project of trying to understand AI as a kind of a tool for planning, a kind of master tool for socialist planning, is doomed, or whether or not there's a kind of perhaps a strange dialectical transformation in which Hayek, by in some ways lighting the spark of connectionism that leads to AI, and then AI leads to planning, or the capacity of planning to happen. There's a sort of a strange gravediggers of the bourgeoisie transformation happening here from 1952 to, let's say, 1929 or something, some soon in the future.
Yeah, Hayek was dangerous for being probably a smart mind, that was very well literate about the scientific research of his age, and was stealing a lot of ideas. If you think also the way he was one of the first, to deploy the idea of pattern that today is so trendy, pattern recognition, pattern generation. But Hayek was one of the first. He was very smart, stealing this idea. And his epistemology is interesting because it's an epistemology based on spontaneous planning or spontaneous modeling, and was much more advanced than indeed of this postulates of the Dartmouth workshop on AI from 1956 that we consider the beginning of AI. What they discussed at Dartmouth workshop was, for me, a very simplified and reductivist and almost useless view of what human intelligence and machine intelligence would be.
There's this famous moment when someone, I think, just says that the entire problem of machine perception could be solved in a summer by a bright graduate student, and of course here we are, how many years later, still working on this machine problem.
But no, that book by Hayek, The Sensory Order, is one of the first books to also reach and the discussion on what would be a form of algorithmic modeling, or what does it mean to model the world rather to representing, right? Knowing how rather than knowing that. It's part of that debate. And for us, it should be taken seriously, because indeed Hayek had an idea that, planning, it's something, you should develop, probably not in a very rigid way, but in a very spontaneous way. So I think the current form of AI, machine learning, deep learning, belongs to this old tradition of, we can call it spontaneous organization, spontaneous planning, and technique of self-organization that actually were concerns also of the U.S. Army research in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And in the book, I tried to rediscover these conferences on self-organization that were related to neural network research. They were like indeed, engaging with a much more sophisticated paradigm than other discussion organizations. And it was the same milieu from which the idea of the internet, the ARPANET, emerged. A network that could self-organize itself in case of danger or attack, a network that could self-repair itself. And so I think also the genealogy of the internet and the genealogy of artificial neural network had some common moment in some, research conferences that are not very well illuminated.
This connectionist AI is in some ways truncated and by a paper by Minsky and Puppet, which leads to what is normally referred to as the AI winter, in which there's a huge dip in the amount of research that is going into artificial intelligence. And you outline in the book that there's sort of a almost quite petty kind of squabble over funding, or attempt to withdraw funding back to MIT, where Minsky and Puppet are based. And I want to kind of zoom forward, taking that sort of notion that these nominally autonomous technologies are embedded not just in the social organization of labor, as we've covered, but also in this kind of strange, petty political squabbles between like different researchers, and bring us forward into a particular reading of what's happening right now in AI, which is that very rapidly there are incumbent players, so things like OpenAI and Microsoft behind them, and even Google, are attempting to get legislation or regulation passed for the field of AI, normally about existential risk, normally about the possibility that AI might, in some way, kill us all, and therefore they argue for regulation on that basis. There's another reading of that, which is that what is really happening here is that the incumbent players are trying to solidify their position and lock out other people who might come up and prevent them from compete with them. What's your read of that situation? How do you see this kind of like political squabble going on at the moment in the field of AI?
Starting from Minsky.
Well, taking the idea that AI is like dominated not only by political concerns but also by struggles for supremacy, struggles for dominance in the field itself.
Well, what is interesting of AI as an invention that did not emerge, very quickly. I mean, it took like 60 years to consolidate. So, I mean, the logical form was somehow, invented by Rosenblatt in mid-1950s. So it took like 60 years to consolidate. More or less the same time the steam engine took. Other inventions in the past took more or less the same time. So AI is not that recent, that I was trying to demonstrate in my book. And it's still, interestingly enough, an experimental artifact, right? So we don't have today what is called a theory of statistical learning. We don't know indeed how this large language models sometimes operate. We have, trillion of parameters. We push the button. Sometimes we get a great result, but we don't know exactly sometimes what is going on inside. What does it mean? It happened also in the past, Machines were invented and then, they were studied according to sometimes their normal or abnormal behavior. So still today, AI is in this experimental phase. Being an experiment, of course, there comes with some risk. What you said about today, the regulation regarding the impact on AI, is correct. These AI monopolies are probably, trying to maintain their own monopoly. This system are fantastic system that are matching perfectly monopoly capitalism. They are platform that, that can be operated by, large companies with large infrastructure, large computing power, and probably they like to secure their dominant position. And what is interesting for me is the fact that information technologies in the last century have been demonstrated to be great technology for monopolization. So they produce monopolies faster than other technology. And AI itself is producing monopoly faster than any other technology. So there is this drive towards monopoly that is within, the history of computation that is very interesting to me.
And that's in some ways where I think for some people the utopian aspects of it come, is the idea that because it's assembling the general intellect, or it's because it's assembling a picture of the general intellect, that there is a possibility of some liberatory potential here. And I wonder what you think about that. Like, do you see, firstly on the sort of the dystopian side, where do you see the domain of existential risk? And then secondly, do you see there as being a sort of a component over to, let's say, the left of the distribution towards a more sort of utopian use of these tools that, as I mentioned earlier, lead to the sort of the grave digging of capitalism as such? Or is your understanding of the history as based on the social division of labor, does that preclude that kind of revolutionary aspect to AI?
I don't have any prophecy at the moment. What I'm interested in is to follow the transformation of the labor market in this sense, that today I see these algorithms not used just for the automation of labor. I see them very often for the automation of management. They're replacing bosses more often than workers, and actually they're multiplying workers. So to bring a good example what would be the effect of AI in society, we should look at the transformation of the labor market and these new figures like the driver, the rider, all the workers of the gig economy, the care worker, controlled by online platform and so on. So this phenomenon of platformization of labor is really related to the application of this algorithm in the organization of labor, but in which, in the way they replace managers more often than workers, and they multiply workers actually. And I think AI is somehow doing this, is becoming an apparatus, a centralized apparatus for the organization of labor, in which we are all prostheses. We are becoming, gig worker of this large AI, this large platform that is basically operating an automated intelligence, but at the end organizing a different social order regarding labor.
There's a sense in which when we use these tools, we sit at our laptops and type something and a giant cloud computer delivers us an answer. We have a sense that we are using a prosthesis, but in some other much more profound sense, perhaps, the prosthesis is us, and we are being used by the social division of labor. Matteo Pasquinelli, thank you very much.
Thanks to you.